Imagine this. It's 6 o'clock on a winter evening in 1850. There is no light switch on the wall. No television glowing in the corner of the room. No phone buzzing in your pocket. As the sun slips below the horizon, darkness arrives quickly. In a small farmhouse kitchen, a woman stands beside an empty hearth. The house is already growing cold, and she knows that what she does next will decide whether her family stays warm tonight, eats a hot meal, or sits together in silence and darkness. Her hands reach for a bundle of kindling. For the next 2 hours, her entire world will revolve around fire. This isn't a camping trip. It isn't romantic. It's survival. And for women across America and Europe, this moment repeated itself every single evening for centuries. So what did they do with those long dark hours? How did they fill the time we now spend scrolling, streaming, and staring at glowing screens? The answer might surprise you. It might even change the way you look at your own evenings. But before we step into that firelit world together, let me ask you something. If stories like this fascinate you, if you're curious about how our great-great-grandmothers lived their daily lives, consider subscribing to the channel. A simple like on the video also helps more people discover these forgotten pieces of history. And I'd love to know, where are you watching from tonight? What time is it where you are? Leave a comment below. I read every single one, and your messages are what keep these late-night storytelling sessions going. Now if you can dim the lights around you, let the room grow a little quieter. Maybe turn on a fan or some soft background noise. Get comfortable. Tonight we're stepping into the year 1850. And I promise you the evening you're about to experience is very different from the one you know. The first thing you need to understand about evenings before electricity is this. Fire wasn't just important. Fire was everything. When I say everything, I mean that the entire structure of a woman's evening, her schedule, her work, her social life, even her relationships, revolved around the hearth. The fireplace or stove was far more than a source of warmth. It was the sun around which the entire household revolved. Let me paint you a picture. It's November in Massachusetts in the year 1852. A woman, let's call her Sarah, lives on a small farm with her husband and 3 children. The sun sets at 4:30 in the afternoon. By 5 o'clock, the world outside is completely dark. Inside the house, the temperature is dropping quickly. Sarah knows that if she doesn't build the evening fire properly, her family could spend the next 6 hours shivering. But she also knows that if she burns too much wood tonight, she may not have enough fuel left to last through the long winter until spring. And here is something most people today don't realize. Building a fire in the 1800s was not like turning on a gas stove or flicking a switch. It was an art form. Sarah starts with tinder, dry leaves, wood shavings, maybe some birch bark she collected last summer. Then comes the kindling, small sticks arranged in a specific pattern to allow airflow. Only then can she add larger logs. But she cannot just stack them randomly. The placement determines how long the fire burns, how much heat it produces, and whether smoke fills the room or goes up the chimney. This process takes about 30 minutes. If everything goes perfectly, often it does not. The wood might be damp, the chimney might have a blockage, the wind might be blowing from the wrong direction. I found a diary entry from a woman in Vermont who wrote in 1848. So spent 2 hours trying to coax the wretched fire to life. My fingers were numb, my eyes streaming from smoke, and still the house remained cold as a tomb. Finally succeeded by 7 o'clock, only to realize I had no energy left to cook supper. Can you imagine? 2 hours just to get warm. And this was not a one-time disaster. This was a normal Tuesday. But here is where it gets interesting. Once that fire was burning, once the warmth started to spread through the room, everything changed. The hearth became magnetic. Family members would naturally drift toward it. Chairs were positioned in a semicircle around the fireplace. Light spilled from the flames, creating a warm orange glow that softened faces and cast dancing shadows on the walls. This was not just a heat source. This was the social center of the home. Think about how we gather around televisions today. The couch faces the screen. We orient our entire living room around that glowing rectangle. In the 1800s, the fireplace served that exact purpose, except it was interactive. It required constant attention. Every 20 minutes or so, someone needed to add another log. Every hour, the ashes needed to be shifted. The fire was a living thing, and it kept people engaged, present, and together in a way that is hard for us to understand. Now, I want you to notice something remarkable here. In our modern world, we work so hard to automate everything. We want our homes to heat themselves, our lights to turn on with voice commands, our entertainment to require zero effort. But Sarah and women like her had no choice but to be constantly actively involved in maintaining their environment. And you know what? There was something deeply satisfying about that. A historian named Ruth Schwartz Cowan studied household labor in the 19th century. She found something surprising in women's letters and diaries. Yes, they complained about the work. Yes, they were exhausted, but they also expressed a sense of competence, of mastery, of pride. When Sarah successfully built a fire that burned steadily all evening, keeping her family warm and allowing her to cook dinner, she felt accomplished. She had created comfort from raw materials. She had controlled her environment through skill and knowledge. We have lost that, have we not? When was the last time you felt genuinely proud of keeping your home warm? You just set the thermostat and forget about it? There is convenience in that, absolutely. But there is also a loss, a disconnection from the basic acts of survival and care. Now, let me tell you about the economics of fire because this is where things get really interesting. In 1850, a typical household in New England would use somewhere between 200 and 300 pounds of coal per week during winter. If they burned wood instead, they needed even more. Estimates suggest a family could go through several cords of wood per season. A cord of wood, by the way, is a stack measuring 4 t high, 4 t wide, and 8 feet long. Picture that. Now, picture needing multiple cords to survive one winter. This meant that men and boys spent enormous amounts of time in autumn chopping, splitting, and stacking wood. But who managed the daily consumption? Who decided how many logs to burn each evening? Who balanced warmth against scarcity? The women, and they became incredibly skilled at it. One woman in rural Ohio kept detailed records in 1863. She noted that on the coldest nights she could keep the main room comfortable with 4 large logs and 6 smaller pieces over a 5-hour evening. On milder nights, 2 logs and some kindling sufficed. She knew exactly which would burn hottest, hickory and oak, and which burned longest. She knew that maple produced less smoke and was better when someone in the family had a cough. This was not casual knowledge. This was expertise developed over years of practice. And here is the fascinating part. This expertise had to be passed down. Mothers taught daughters. Older women taught younger neighbors. There were no YouTube tutorials, obviously, no instructional manuals. The knowledge lived in women's hands and memories. If you could not build a proper fire, you could not run a household. It was that simple. Let me share one more detail that really drives this home. Candles and lamp oil were expensive. Really expensive. A pound of candles in 1850 cost about 10, which does not sound like much until you realize that the average laborer earned about $1 per day. So, a pound of candles represented 10% of a daily wage, and a single candle might burn for only 2 to 4 hours. This meant that most families used minimal lighting in the evenings. They relied heavily on firelight. Women positioned their chairs close to the hearth, not just for warmth, but for light. If you wanted to sew, read, write a letter, any activity that required seeing, you needed to be right by the fire. This created an interesting social dynamic. Everyone was physically close. You could not retreat to separate rooms the way we do now. You were together whether you liked it or not. And you know what I find beautiful about this? It forced conversation. It forced connection. Yes, sometimes people probably wanted space. Yes, families argued and tensions existed. But they could not just scroll on their phones to avoid each other. They could not put on headphones and disappear into a private world. They were present. They had to be. There is a letter I came across from a woman in Philadelphia written in 1857. She described her evening routine. After supper we gather by the fire. John reads the newspaper aloud while I mend stockings. The children play quietly with wooden blocks at our feet. Sometimes we do not speak for an hour, but the silence feels companionable, not lonely. The crackling fire and the occasional turn of a page are the only sounds. I find a peace in these evenings that the daylight hours, with their rush and noise, do not provide. That word companionable silence struck me. When was the last time you sat in companionable silence with someone? Not awkward silence, not silence because you're both on your phones, but genuine comfortable shared quiet. I think we've almost lost the ability to tolerate that kind of peace. The hearth also had seasonal rhythms that structured the entire year. In summer the evening fire was minimal, just enough to cook supper. Then quickly extinguished because of the heat. Women would take their handwork outside in the lingering twilight. But come autumn, as the days shortened and temperatures dropped, the fire reclaimed its central position. October meant it was time to check the chimney, repair any cracks in the hearthstones, and stock up on fuel. By November, the fire burned most of the day and all evening. This continued through March or April depending on the climate. Imagine living so closely attuned to the seasons. We climate control our way through the year now, barely noticing the shifts. But women in the 1800s felt every change intimately. The return of the evening fire marked a transition not just in weather, but in lifestyle. Winter evenings meant more indoor time, more family time, more handwork and storytelling. There was actually something to look forward to in the darker months. A coziness and togetherness that summer's longer days and outdoor work did not provide. I want to pause here and acknowledge something important. I am describing this world with a certain warmth and nostalgia. And I need to be honest, it was also brutally hard. Women's hands were rough and often burned from managing fires. Eyes were irritated by smoke. Backs ached from bending over hearths. The labor was relentless, and there was no day off, no vacation from keeping the fire alive. I do not want to romanticize that struggle. But I also do not want us to miss what was valuable in that way of life. There was a rhythm, a purpose, a set of skills that mattered deeply. And there was an enforced presence with family, with the work of survival, with the natural world cycles that we have almost entirely lost. As electric light spread in the late 1800s and early 1900s, something profound shifted. Suddenly you could read in any room. You could separate. You could extend the day artificially. Women's labor did not necessarily decrease. That is a whole other complicated story. But the social structure of the evening changed dramatically. The hearth stopped being the center. And then came radio, then television, and here we are, each of us often in a separate room, staring at separate screens, living in our own isolated bubbles of entertainment. We gained so much, but we lost the fire. Here is what I want you to take from this. The next time you adjust your thermostat without thinking, or flick on a light switch, or settle in for an evening of streaming, pause for just a second. Feel a little gratitude for the women who spent their evenings battling smoke and cold to create the same comfort you now access with the button. And maybe, just maybe, consider what it would mean to create your own hearth. Not literally, of course, but metaphorically. What if you designated one evening so week to gather with the people in your home? No screens, just presents, just conversation or comfortable chest or a shared activity. What if you tried to reclaim a tiny piece of what Sarah and millions of women like her experienced every single night? That sense of togetherness, of working together to create warmth and light. I think there is something we're hungry for in that. I think that is why cozy evenings, hygge, slow living, these concepts resonate so deeply right now. We are not just nostalgic for an imaginary past. We are recognizing something valuable that got lost in the rush toward convenience. The evening hearth was not just about fire. It was about presence. It was about ritual. It was about the daily act of creating home. And while we cannot and probably should not go back to that level of labor, we can think about what we want our evenings to feel like. We can choose to build our own kind of hearth, whatever form that takes. So, as we close this first part of our journey, I want you to imagine Sarah one more time. It is nearly 9 o'clock. The fire has burned down to glowing coals. The children are asleep upstairs, bundled under quilts. Sarah banks the fire carefully, ensuring enough embers survive until morning, when she will coax it back to life. Her husband is already in bed. She takes a final moment by the dying light, perhaps touching the warm stones of the hearth, feeling the day's work in her tired muscles, and then she too retires. Tomorrow morning, well, a few hours from now really, she will start it all over again. And so will we in our own way. But before Sarah goes to sleep and before we move forward in our story, there is something else happening by that firelight. While the fire keeps the family warm, Sarah's hands are not idle. They are busy with needle and thread, creating something beautiful from scraps of fabric. And that needlework, those evening hours spent stitching, reveals an entirely different layer of women's evening lives. One that blended necessity with artistry, economy with expression, survival with beauty. What did those needles create? What did those evening hours of stitching mean? And why did a woman's skill with a needle determine not just her family's warmth, but her own value in society? That is where we are headed next. Into a world where every stitch carried meaning and every evening brought the quiet rhythm of thread pulling through fabric. Stay with me. The story is just beginning to unfold. So there she sits. Sarah, our woman from 1850. The fire is crackling. Her family has eaten dinner. The dishes are washed. And now finally she can sit down. But her hands do not rest. They never really rest. Instead, she reaches into her sewing basket, pulls out a piece of fabric with a hole in it, threads her needle by firelight and begins to darn. You might think this is just mending, just fixing things. But oh, it is so much more than that. Because in the world before television, before electric lights, before mass-produced clothing you could buy ready-made at a store, a woman's skill with the needle quite literally determined her worth. Not her character. Not her intelligence, not her kindness, her needlework. The tiny stitches she could execute by dim firelight were being judged, assessed, and used to decide whether she was marriageable, respectable, accomplished, whether she was valuable. Does that make you uncomfortable? It should, because we are about to enter a world where embroidery was not a hobby, it was a test. And every evening women sat in judgment, stitching their way towards social acceptance or rejection. Let me take you back further, not to 1850 now, but to 1789. A 9-year-old girl named Marianne Body sits at a table, bent over a piece of fabric stretched tight in an embroidery frame. Her fingers are small, still growing, but they're already learning the alphabet in thread. She stitches each letter carefully. Capital A, lowercase a, capital B, lowercase b, row after row until the sampler is covered in her work. This is not art class. This is not for fun. This is her education. This piece of fabric will be kept, possibly framed, and shown to future employers or suitors to prove that Marianne has been properly trained, that she possesses the patience, the precision, the feminine accomplishment required of a respectable woman. Now imagine being Marianne. You're 9 years old. Your eyes hurt from squinting at the tiny stitches. Your fingers are cramped. You would rather be outside playing, exploring, reading a book. But no, you must stitch because your future depends on it. Your sampler is your resume, your report card, your proof of worth, all rolled into one. This was the reality for girls across social classes, though the details differed. Working-class girls learned plain sewing, making and mending simple clothing, darning stockings until the original fabric was barely visible beneath layers of careful repairs. They learned this not as an accomplishment but as survival. If you could not sew, you could not clothe your family. If you could not darn, you would go through stockings at a rate your budget could never sustain. But middle and upper class girls, they learned something else entirely. They learned what was called fancy work, embroidery, decorative stitching, the kind of needlework that served no practical purpose except to demonstrate refinement, patience, and marriageability. Let that sink in for a moment. They spent hours, no years, of their evenings learning a skill whose primary function was to prove they were suitable wives. Here is what the Victorian needlework hierarchy looked like. And yes, there was an actual hierarchy. At the very bottom was plain sewing, making clothes, mending tiers, darning socks. This was considered suitable for servants and working-class women. Respectable but not impressive. A step up from that was knitting. Knitting lived a double life. Servants knitted stockings by candlelight because they had to. But ladies of the house also knitted, not for utility, but to pass time during social occasions. Knitting could be done while chatting, while listening to someone read aloud, while sitting in a parlor with guests. Your hands stayed busy, proving you were not idle, but your mind was free to socialize. And at the very top of the pyramid, fancy needlework, embroidery on ecclesiastical linens, decorative cross-stitch, elaborate patterns worked in silk thread on fine fabric. This was the realm of accomplished ladies. This was what got you noticed. Charlotte Bronte understood this perfectly. In her novel Jane Eyre, she uses needlework to signal social status. The servant Hannah is seen knitting stockings by candlelight, plain work, utilitarian, low status. But Eliza Reed from a wealthy family spends her time creating elaborate embroidered decorations for church linens. Her needlework is fancy, regimented, full of moral rectitude but empty of passion. Bronte is making a point here. The needlework you did revealed not just your social class, but your very character. So, what did this look like in practice? What were women actually doing during those evening hours by the fireside? Let me give you some numbers because the scale of this will surprise you. A typical middle-class woman in the mid-1800s might spend anywhere from 2 to 4 hours per evening on needlework. That is 14 to 28 hours per week. Over a year, 700 to 400 hours spent stitching. By the time a woman reached age 40, she might have logged over 30,000 hours of needlework. 30,000 hours. Think about what you could master in that amount of time. A musical instrument, multiple languages, advanced mathematics. But instead, these hours went into creating decorative pillowcases, embroidered collars, crocheted doilies, knitted shawls, items whose primary purpose was to signal that the woman had time, skill, and proper feminine training. And the judgment never stopped. When you visited someone's home, you noticed their needlework. You commented on it. You compared it to your own or to other women's work. An 1873 issue of Harper's Bazaar talked about women who had turned their fancy needlework skills into profit. One widow, the magazine reported, paid off the mortgage on her city house and supported herself and her child for many years, almost entirely with her swift crochet needle. That is remarkable. That is a woman using the one marketable skill she'd been taught to survive. But here is the darker side. For every woman who successfully monetized her needlework, there were dozens who worked in what was called the sweated labor system. Professional seamstresses, women who sewed for a living, faced conditions we can barely imagine. Let me tell you about a woman named Mrs. Lavinia Casey. In the 1880s she made shirts. She was paid 7p per dozen. She worked from 7 in the morning until 11 at night, 16 hours. In that time, after caring for her children, she managed about 12 hours of actual sewing. She typically completed 2 dozen shirts per day. Her total wage, 1 shilling and 2p. From that, she had to pay 2 shillings and 6p per week to rent her Singer sewing machine, plus another shilling for oil and thread. Do the math. She barely broke even and she worked 16-hour days. This was not unusual. This was normal for working-class seamstresses. The sewing machine, which we think of as a labor-saving device, actually made their lives worse. It allowed factory owners to demand more production in less time. The machine became, as one historian put it, a new taskmaster, a slave driver, an instrument of degradation. So when we talk about women's evening needlework, we have to hold 2 realities in our heads at once. For some women, middle and upper-class women sitting in comfortable parlors, needlework was a leisure activity, an accomplishment, a way to pass evening hours while chatting with family. But for other women, needlework was brutal labor, poorly paid, physically exhausting and inescapable. The same skill, vastly different meanings. Can you see why I wanted to tell you this story? Because we romanticize the past. We see images of Victorian women doing embroidery and think how peaceful, how meditative, how lovely. And for some it was, but for many it was survival. It was judgment. It was the narrow path they had to walk to be considered worthy of marriage, employment, or social respect. Now, let me pull you back to Sarah for a moment because I want to show you what this looked like in one woman's evening. Sarah sits by the fire. Her mending basket is full. There are stockings with holes. Her husband's work socks have worn through at the heel again. There is her son's shirt with a torn seam. There is a nightgown for her daughter that needs to be let down as the girl grows. And there is a pillowcase she's been embroidering for months, slowly adding a decorative border whenever she has time. She starts with the stockings. Darning is precise work. You cannot just sew over the hole. You have to create a woven patch that matches the original fabric structure. First, she runs parallel threads across the hole in one direction. Then, she weaves the needle over and under those threads in the perpendicular direction, creating a grid that fills the gap. Done well, a darn is nearly invisible and as strong as the original fabric. Done poorly, it creates a lumpy, uncomfortable spot that will wear through even faster. Sarah learned to darn from her mother, who learned from her mother, who learned from hers. The knowledge passed down through generations, mother to daughter, evening after evening, firelight after firelight. And young girls practiced on darning samplers, pieces of fabric where they deliberately created holes, then practiced filling them with different weaving patterns. Some of these samplers still exist in museums. Beautiful, colorful geometric patterns, created solely to teach the skill of invisible repair. But here's what gets me. Sarah does this work by firelight. Maybe she has a single candle if the family can afford to burn one. Her eyes strain. Her back aches from bending forward. Her fingers, after hours of stitching, develop calluses. By the time she is 50, her eyesight might be permanently damaged from years of close work in dim light. This was not uncommon. Women frequently lost their near vision, developed chronic eye strain, or suffered from headaches, all from evening needlework. And yet, they kept stitching because what choice did they have? Clothing was expensive. A single ready-made shirt might cost a week's wages for a working-class family. So, you mended, you darned, you patched, you turned collars when they frayed, cutting them off and reattaching them upside down to get more wear. You unpicked worn-out garments and used the good fabric to make children's clothes. Nothing was wasted. Every scrap had value. This brings us to something fascinating. The distinction between plain work and fancy work was not just about skill level. It was about time. Plain work was necessary. You had to do it to maintain your family's clothing. But fancy work, that was optional. That was a luxury. If you had time in your evening for decorative embroidery, it meant you were not desperately behind on mending. It meant you had help. Servants who did the plain work while you focused on the fancy. Or it meant you deliberately carved out time, perhaps sacrificing sleep to create something beautiful. I found a quote from Isabella Beeton's 1861 book of household management that captures this perfectly. She wrote, "Light or fancy needlework often forms a portion of the evening's recreation for the ladies of the household. Recreation, not labor. For wealthy women, embroidery was recreation. For their ladies' maids, plain sewing was employment. The same activity, completely different meanings. And here is where it gets really interesting. Some women rebelled against this system through their needlework. They used their stitches to make political statements. The suffrage movement in the early 1900s created elaborate embroidered banners. These banners featured the names of female scientists, authors, academics, suffrage leaders. They included slogans like "Justice for All" and "Votes for Women." Think about the brilliance of this. These women took a traditionally feminine craft, embroidery, and weaponized it. They took the skill they had been forced to learn as proof of their domestic suitability and used it to demand political power. The Artists' Suffrage League understood that embroidery could move from the private domestic sphere into the public political sphere, and it did. So when Sarah sits by her fire darning stockings and occasionally working on her decorative pillowcase, she is participating in a tradition that is simultaneously beautiful and oppressive, creative and constraining, empowering and limiting. Her needles are tools of survival, markers of status, evidence of skill, and potentially, though she might not know it yet, instruments of resistance. Now, I want you to imagine something with me. Imagine if we had taken all those hours, those 30,000 hours that women spent on needlework over a lifetime, and given them different tools. What if instead of needles and thread, we'd given them pens and paper? What if we had said, use these evening hours to write, to study, to experiment, to create in ways that build knowledge rather than just demonstrate accomplishment? What might women have achieved? We will never know. But we can honor what they did achieve within the constraints they faced. Because let me be clear, I am not dismissing needlework as worthless. The skills involved are real. The artistry is genuine. The objects created. Quilts that kept families warm. Samplers that preserved family history. Embroidered pieces that brought beauty into harsh lives. These mattered. They still matter. What I am saying is that women deserve choice. They deserve to decide whether to spend their evenings sewing or reading or writing or doing mathematics or staring into the fire and thinking deep thoughts without their hands needing to be busy. They deserve to have their worth measured by something other than the evenness of their stitches. And yet, despite all of this, despite the judgment, the eye strain, the endless hours, many women found genuine joy in their needlework. The rhythm of stitching can be meditative. The act of creating something with your hands is satisfying in a way that is hard to explain to someone who has never experienced it. There is a reason why knitting, embroidery, and cross-stitch are experiencing a resurgence today. People are rediscovering the pleasure of handwork in our hyperdigital age. But here is the difference today. When you pick up a needle, you choose it. It is not mandatory. It is not being judged. Your marriage prospects do not depend on it. And that freedom, that ability to sew for pleasure rather than obligation, that is the gift the past could not give these women. As Sarah finishes darning the last stocking, she folds her work and places it back in the basket. Tomorrow night there will be more mending. There is always more mending. But tomorrow night might also bring something different. Tomorrow night she might gather with other women. She might attend what they call a quilting bee. And those gatherings, those were magic. Because when women came together around needlework, something transformed. The work became secondary. The connection became primary. And in those circles of women bent over fabric stitching and talking and laughing, an entirely different kind of evening emerged. One we need to explore because it reveals how women turned solitary labor into social revolution. But that story deserves its own space, its own time. So stay with me. Keep the lights low. Let the fire in your mind burn a little brighter because we're about to enter the most social, the most subversive, the most powerful expression of women's evening culture before television, the quilting bee. And trust me, it is not what you think. Picture this. It is a Wednesday morning in November 1862. In a farmhouse in rural Iowa, a woman named Martha wakes before dawn. But today is different. Today is not just another day of cooking, cleaning, childcare, and endless chores. Today is the quilting bee, and that changes everything. Martha hurries through her morning work. She bakes extra bread. She prepares a large pot of stew that can simmer all day without much attention. She sweeps the main room and sets up the quilting frame. 4 long pieces of wood that create a rectangle large enough to hold an entire quilt. By 9 o'clock in the morning, women start arriving. They come on foot, on horseback, and wagons. Some have traveled 5 miles. One woman has brought her infant bundled against the cold. Another brings her elderly mother who can no longer sew, but loves the company. And here is what you need to understand. This is not just a sewing circle. This is the original social network. This is Facebook, Instagram, and group chat all rolled into one. This is where information flows, where alliances form, where women support each other through the hardest parts of their lives. This is where isolated farm wives who might not see another woman for weeks suddenly find themselves part of a community. And it happens around a quilt. Now you might be wondering, why quilts? Why did quilting bees become so central to women's evening culture? And the answer is actually quite practical. Making a quilt top, piecing together all those small fabric squares into a pattern, that was something you could do alone slowly over months. You could work on it in spare moments. But quilting the actual quilt, that is when you attach the decorative top layer to the batting and backing layer with thousands of tiny stitches. And that work goes so much faster with multiple hands. What might take one woman weeks to complete, 8 women could finish in a single day. So quilting bees were efficient. But efficiency was never the real point. The real point was this: women needed each other. And quilting bees gave them permission to gather, to talk, to exist in community in a world that otherwise kept them isolated on separate farms and in separate households. The golden age of quilting bees was roughly 1840 to 1875. This was the era of westward expansion, a massive immigration, the Civil War, and incredible social upheaval. And right in the middle of all that chaos, women were gathering around quilting frames, creating beauty, and building networks that would sustain them through unimaginable hardship. Let me tell you about one specific quilt that captures this perfectly. Have you ever heard of the Jane Stickle quilt? Jane was a woman living in Vermont during the Civil War. Between 1851 and 1854, she created a quilt that contained 562 individual pieces of fabric. 562 pieces, each one cut, arranged, and sewn into intricate patterns. The quilt measures roughly 80 in square, and contains 169 different block patterns, plus a complex border. It is a masterpiece, but here is what makes it extraordinary. Jane did not do this alone. According to records and local history, Jane frequently sewed with friends at her home. She was part of a quilting community. Those 562 pieces represent not just Jane's skill, but also hours of conversation, shared laughter, exchanged recipes, whispered confidences, and mutual support. The quilt is beautiful, but the relationships that formed around it, those were priceless. Now you are probably imagining a peaceful scene. Women sitting quietly, stitching, maybe humming hymns. And sometimes it was like that. But often it was loud, it was gossipy, it was full of debate and laughter and occasionally tears. Because when you put 8 women in a room for 6 to 8 hours with their hands busy but their minds free, everything comes out, everything. One woman who kept a diary in 1860 wrote about a quilting bee where the conversation ranged from recipes for preserving peaches to concerns about a neighbor's sick child to passionate arguments about slavery and abolition. Yes, abolition. Political discussions happened at quilting bees. In fact, quilting bees became one of the primary venues where women discussed politics precisely because they were women-only spaces where men did not control the conversation. And here is something that will blow your mind. Susan B. Anthony, the famous suffragist, made her first speeches about political rights at quilting bees when she was a teenager. Quilting bees, not formal political gatherings, not men's debating societies. Quilting bees. By the early 1900s, women's rights had become such a frequent topic at quilting bees that they were essentially functioning as organizing spaces for the suffrage movement. Let me paint the full picture of what a typical quilting bee looked like. The women arrive around 9 o'clock in the morning. The hostess has already stretched the quilt layers onto the frame. The decorative top that has been pieced together over months. A layer of cotton batting for warmth and a plain backing fabric. The 3 layers are basted together loosely, then attached to the frame. Now comes the quilting itself. The women arrange themselves around the frame. Typically, 7 or 8 can fit comfortably, though some larger frames accommodated 10 or 12. Each woman has a needle, thread, and a thimble, and they begin stitching. The goal is to create small, even stitches that go through all 3 layers, creating patterns that add both structure and beauty. Some quilts have simple straight line quilting. Others feature elaborate designs, feathers, flowers, geometric patterns that require significant skill. As they stitch, they talk. And this is where the magic happens. Because in a world where women's literacy rates were lower than men's, where newspapers were expensive and often unavailable, where travel was difficult and communication slow, quilting bees functioned as news networks. A woman who had visited town last week shares what she learned at the general store. Another woman passes along a letter she received from relatives back east. Someone mentions that a particular merchant has raised his prices or that a new family has moved into the area. Information flows. But it was not just news. It was support. Practical, immediate, life-saving support. If a woman was struggling to feed her family, other women would know and they would quietly arrange to leave extra food or to take her children for a day so she could rest or to help with a particularly overwhelming task. If a woman was being abused by her husband, the other women knew. They might not have had the legal power to intervene, but they could offer refuge, advice, or at least the knowledge that she was not alone. One pioneering woman who settled in Texas in the 1830s later recalled quilting bees where women might try to outrival each other in the daintiness of their stitches, but they also helped each other in every way. She said, and I love this quote, they helped each other. Perhaps this justifies the whole of a pioneer woman's suffering. Perhaps this justifies the whole of a pioneer woman's suffering. Think about that. The community formed at quilting bees was so valuable, so essential that it justified the incredible hardship of frontier life. And quilting bees had rituals. Oh, the rituals. If a quilting bee was gathered to create a wedding quilt for a young bride, the finished quilt would be placed on the floor when it was done. Then a cat would be put in the middle of the quilt, and all the unmarried young people would sit around the edges. Whoever's head the cat jumped over was said to be the next person to marry. Can you imagine? This is pieting algorithms, folks. This is feline-powered matchmaking. Or consider the freedom quilt. When a man celebrated his 21st birthday in New England, quilters often presented him with a specially made quilt. This was called a freedom quilt because it symbolized his freedom to leave home and establish his own household. It was a practical gift. He would need bedding, but also a symbolic one. The quilt represented the community's blessing on his transition to adulthood. And then there were memory quilts made from the clothing of deceased loved ones. Imagine losing your husband in the Civil War. His body never returned. You have nothing but his clothes. So, you cut up his shirts, his trousers, and you piece them into a quilt. Now every night you sleep under a blanket made from his fabric. The quilt becomes a memorial, a source of comfort, a tangible connection to someone you have lost. Women at quilting bees helped each other make these memory quilts. They shared the grief, they shared the work, and they created something beautiful from profound loss. But here is where quilting bees get really interesting. They were not just passive social gatherings. They were sites of resistance. During the abolitionist movement, women in the North created quilts specifically to raise money for the cause. They held quilting bees where they would make multiple quilts, then sell or raffle them at fairs. The proceeds went to support escaped slaves or to fund anti-slavery publications. An observer in 1847 wrote about sewing circles where one of the members would read an anti-slavery book or paper to the others during the meeting. These women could not vote. They could not hold political office, but they could sew, and they turned their needles into weapons of social change. During the Civil War itself, quilting bees ramped up production to an almost unimaginable degree. Women in both the North and the South organized to make quilts for soldiers. The United States Sanitary Commission, which coordinated relief efforts for Union troops, called for quilts, and women responded. Over 300,000 quilts were created. 300,000. That means 1 out of every 6 Union soldiers was kept warm by a hand-sewn quilt made by women at quilting bees. 1 out of 6. And these were not simple quilts. Women put their hearts into them. They embroidered messages of hope and encouragement. They included their names and locations, hoping that a soldier far from home might feel less alone knowing that a specific woman in a specific town had made this quilt for him. Some quilts had pockets sewn into them where small items could be tucked. A handkerchief, a religious text, a small photograph. Women were trying to send comfort across impossible distances. After the war, quilting bees continued to serve political purposes. The temperance movement, women fighting against alcohol abuse, organized quilting bees to create fundraising quilts. They incorporated the Women's Christian Temperance Union colors into their designs. Blue for water, white for purity. They held bees where they discussed strategies for combating alcoholism, which was devastating families across the country. These women could not pass laws, but they could organize, they could fundraise, they could create public pressure, and it often started at a quilting bee. Now I want to tell you about the social aspect more intimately because quilting bees were not all serious politics and heavy grief. They were also pure fun. The hostess would prepare a large midday meal. This was not optional. This was required. You fed the women who came to help you. And the food was often the highlight. Meat pies, fruit preserves, fresh bread, cakes, cookies. For women whose daily meals were often simple and repetitive, a quilting bee dinner was a feast. And in the evening, because quilting bees did not end when the sun went down. Remember, this was before electric lights, so work might pause when it became too dark to see fine stitches. But that did not mean everyone went home. Instead, the men were invited to arrive. Husbands, sweethearts, brothers, fathers. They came in their Sunday best because a quilting bee evening was a social event. There would be food again, supper, and then music, dancing, singing, courtship. Young people used to quilting bee evenings to meet potential partners. It was one of the few socially acceptable venues where young unmarried people could interact without constant adult supervision. There is even a song about this. It is called Aunt Dinah's Quilting Party, and it tells the story of a couple who stroll home together after such an evening. The song was popular in the mid-1800s and captures the romantic festive atmosphere of these gatherings. But, and this is important, not all quilting bees were open to everyone. Just as there was a hierarchy in needlework skills, there was a hierarchy in quilting bees. Some bees were exclusive. If a woman had created a truly special quilt top, something intricate and beautiful, she wanted it quilted by women with exceptional skill. Because here is the thing, anyone can learn to piece a quilt top. But quilting itself, creating those tiny, even stitches that takes years of practice, and a poorly quilted top could ruin months of work. So skilled quilters were in demand. Being invited to an exclusive bee was a mark of social prestige. It meant your stitching was good enough that other women trusted you with their finest work. This created a weird dynamic where quilting bees were simultaneously egalitarian. Anyone could participate in a basic bee, and hierarchical, the best quilters formed an elite group. In isolated regions, though these hierarchies mattered less, a woman in the Southwest reminisced one day a week when the neighbors came to quilt. My brother would take the bed in Mama's room down to the kitchen and put up the frame for that day. It was quite a job, but he never minded. There were no more than 4 women working cause there was no room for more. 4 women in a kitchen with a bed frame being moved every week just to make space for quilting. That is how much it mattered. That is how essential these gatherings were. And here is something modern viewers of historical dramas often miss. Quilting bees were loud. They were messy. There were children running underfoot. Babies were nursed during the quilting. Older children might be assigned to watch younger ones outside or in another room. But inevitably, someone would cry or fall or need attention. Dogs wandered in and out. The fire needed tending. Someone had to stir the stew. Life did not stop for quilting bees. The quilting happened in the midst of life. But that was part of the beauty. Women were not performing some idealized version of femininity. They were themselves. They could be tired, grumpy, frustrated, joyful, silly, serious, all of it. And it was accepted because everyone there understood. Everyone there was living the same exhausting, demanding, occasionally rewarding life. Now you might be wondering what happened to quilting bees. Why did they decline? The answer is complex. The sewing machine, which became widely available in the 1880s and 1890s, sped up the process of piecing quilt tops. So women needed less help with that part. The quilting itself still required hand stitching, but as more women gained access to sewing machines, they could complete projects faster on their own. Then came the telephone. Suddenly you did not need to wait for a quilting bee to get news or talk to a friend. You could pick up the phone. The automobile made travel easier, so women had more options for socializing beyond their immediate neighbors. And slowly, gradually, the necessity of quilting bees faded. By the 1930s and 40s, quilting bees were becoming rare. They were seen as old-fashioned, a quaint relic of pioneer days. Some women's groups still held them, but they were no longer the central social institution they had once been. And with their decline, something valuable was lost. Not just the quilts, though many beautiful quilts stopped being made, but the community, the face-to-face, sustained, intimate community that formed when women worked together for hours at a time, day after day, year after year. Here is what I find most powerful about quilting bees. They took something that could have been isolating. Women confined to domestic labor scattered across rural landscapes and transformed it into connection. They took a necessity, creating warm bedding, and made it beautiful. They took silence and made it conversation. They took powerlessness and made it organizing. Quilting bees were not perfect. They could be exclusive, judgmental, petty. Small-town social dynamics can be cruel as well as supportive. But at their best, quilting bees represented something we have almost lost. The ability to work with your hands while engaging your mind. The experience of creating something useful and beautiful in collaboration with others. The deep knowledge that comes from sustained in-person community. And you know what is remarkable? Quilting bees are making a comeback in the 21st century. Women and men, because quilting is no longer gender-restricted, are forming quilting groups. They meet weekly or monthly. They bring projects. They stitch together. And yes, they talk. They share their lives. They support each other. Turns out that the need for community, for meaningful work, for connection, that need has not disappeared just because we have phones and internet and television. But the quilting bees of today exist in a different context. They are optional. They are leisure. They are not the only social outlet available, and that makes them both less necessary and more precious. When you choose to attend a quilting circle today, you are choosing to put down your phone, step away from your screen, and do something with your hands while connecting with other humans. That choice echoes back through history to Martha in Iowa, Jane in Vermont, and countless unnamed women who found community around a quilting frame. As the evening winds down at Martha's quilting bee, the women admire their work. The quilt is nearly finished. Tomorrow Martha will complete the binding herself. The final step of folding fabric over the edges and stitching it down. But the quilting is done. And more importantly, the connection has been renewed. These women will return to their separate farms, their separate lives. But they go back knowing they are not alone. They go back with news, with recipes, with advice, with laughter still echoing in their ears. They go back changed. And as Martha watches them leave, as she tidies her house and prepares for bed, she might not realize that this quilting bee, this one ordinary Wednesday in 1862, is part of a tradition that will be studied, celebrated, and revived over a century later. She might not know that historians will examine her quilts, that her patterns will be preserved, that her story matters. She just knows that today was good. Today she was not alone. But Martha's day is not quite finished yet. Because once the house is quiet, once the children are asleep and the evening chores complete, Martha will sit by the fire one more time, and she will reach for something different. Not a needle. This time but a pen. Because there is another evening ritual we have not yet explored, one that was just as important as sewing, just as revealing, just as rich with meaning. Martha is going to write a letter. And the art of evening correspondence, the careful selection of paper, the choice of words, the etiquette, the emotion, that is a world unto itself, one we absolutely must enter. Because letters were not just communication. They were lifelines. They were power. They were in some ways the most intimate thing women created by firelight. So let the quilting frame fold away. Let the needles rest. Now we pick up the pen, and what we discover there might just surprise you. The fire has burned low. The children are asleep. The house is finally, blessedly quiet, and Martha sits at her small wooden table with a single candle burning, a sheet of cream-colored paper before her, and a pen in her hand. She pauses, takes a breath, and begins to write. You see this moment right here? This is where women held power in ways that might shock you. Because a letter was not just a letter. A letter was a weapon. A letter was a promise. A letter was a test. And the way you wrote it, the paper you chose, even the color of your ink, all of it was being judged. All of it mattered. In a world where women could not vote, could not own property in many places, could not speak in public forums, they could write letters. And through those letters they shaped politics, controlled courtships, maintained empires of social connection, and occasionally, just occasionally, changed history. But here is what makes this fascinating. Letter writing had rules. So many rules. And women who broke those rules paid for it with damaged reputations, lost marriage prospects, and social exile. So, let me take you inside the Victorian letter writing world because it was elaborate, bizarre, and absolutely ruthless in its demands. First, the paper. You could not just grab any paper. The quality, color, and size of your stationery announced your social class before you even wrote a word. An 1891 etiquette book was very clear on this. Nothing looks more mean and untidy than thin sheets and envelopes of the same quality through which the writing exhibits itself. Translation: cheap paper marks you as cheap. Upper-ass women use thick, high-quality paper. The texture mattered. The weight mattered. Fashion dictated whether paper should be small or large, square or oblong. But one thing never changed. It had to be expensive. And the color, for most correspondence, white or cream, but women had slightly more freedom here than men. Light shades of blue or lavender were sometimes acceptable for ladies. A light spritz of perfume on the paper. That was a matter of debate. Some etiquette guides said it was charming. Others called it vulgar. You had to know your audience. Get it wrong and you were judged. Now, the ink, an 1889 handbook stated, the color of ink most durable and tasteful on all occasions and for all correspondence is black. Red ink should never be used for the body of a letter. Blue ink may be fancy ink, may answer for ladies, but is not in taste for gentlemen. So, women had a tiny bit more creative freedom. They could use colored inks occasionally, but even then restraint was advised. Too much creativity signaled poor breeding. Then came the wax seal. Before envelopes became standard, letters were folded and sealed with wax, and the color of that wax was a language all its own. Black wax meant mourning always. If you received a letter sealed with black wax, you knew immediately that the sender had experienced a death. Red wax was for men, particularly for business correspondence. Women could use a variety of colors, blue, green, gold, depending on the occasion and the recipient. But you had to know the code. Use the wrong color, and you send a message. Are you starting to see how complicated this was? We are not even at the actual writing yet. We are still just setting up to write. And already there are a dozen ways to make a mistake that could taunt you socially. Now her handwriting. Oh, the handwriting. An 1893 guide instructed. The handwriting should be clear and yet not too large and bold. It should possess some character and style, but not be adorned or ornamented with fine flourishes and dashes. So your penmanship had to be legible but not showy, distinctive but not ostentatious, feminine but not weak. How do you achieve all of that? Through practice. Hours and hours of practice. Girls spent their evening time copying letters, practicing their hand, developing a writing style that would be judged acceptables. And here is something that will make you appreciate your keyboard. Writing by candlelight or firelight was hard. Your eyes strained. The flickering light created shadows that made it difficult to see what you were writing. Ink could smudge if your hand moved wrong. And if you made a mistake, you could not just backspace. You had to either cross it out, which looked terrible, or start over entirely. So women learned to compose in their heads before putting pen to paper. They thought through sentences, planned their letters mentally so they could write cleanly the first time. But the real power of letter writing was not in the mechanics. It was in what letters could do. Let me show you. Courtship letters. When a man wanted to court a woman in the Regency and Victorian eras, he had to formally request permission to correspond with her. To that, he had to ask if he could write to her and she could say no. This was one of the most important tools at a young lady's disposal during courtship, the power of refusal. She could refuse to enter into correspondence, which effectively ended the courtship before it began. Because correspondence was serious, it signaled that a couple was moving toward engagement. A historian named Dr. Sally Olai from Oxford Brookes University explains it like this. Accepting signaled a couple was on the road to engagement. So when a woman said yes to correspondence, she was saying yes to a courtship. And that decision carried enormous weight. Now here's where it gets really interesting. What were these courtship letters like? Dr. Olay found something surprising when she studied actual letters from the 1800s. She says, women's letters are marked by their modesty, their reserve. In contrast, men's letters ruminated at enormous length about the nature of love, the depth of their feeling, and many included poems. Men wrote these long, emotional, flowery letters, pages and pages about their feelings. Women were expected to be modest, reserved, careful. They could not appear too eager. They could not express too much emotion. They had to walk this incredibly narrow line between showing enough interest to encourage the man, but not so much interest that they appear desperate or improper. And these letters were not private in the way we think of private. Families often shared courtship letters. A young woman might show her sister or mother a letter she received. A young man might read his letter aloud to his father or brother. So women wrote knowing that their words might be read by multiple people. They had to be careful. Every sentence was calculated. But letters could also be perfumed. Physically perfumed. You would smell it. You might press your lips to it. It was something that had touched the writer's hands and then touched your hands. Dr. Olai describes this beautifully. The letter was not just information. It was a physical object infused with presence. Women would sometimes include a pressed flower, a lock of hair, a small drawing. These letters were sensory experiences, and the letters themselves were valuable as objects. If a courtship ended badly, letters became evidence. They could be used to prove that a man had made promises, or more dangerously, they could be used to damage a woman's reputation. So, women were often advised to burn correspondence after reading it, precisely because letters could be weaponized. Let me tell you about a woman who understood the power of letters better than almost anyone. Jane Austen. Yes, that Jane Austen. She was a prolific letter writer. We have surviving letters where she writes to her young niece, an 8-year-old child, and she writes the entire letter backwards. Every word spelled in reverse. The letter starts yeek. My dear Isaac, backwards she continues. I Hassan, I wish you a happy new year, and she signs it. Roy Atano Chef Enij Netza, your affectionate Aunt Jane Austen. This is linguistic playfulness. This is creativity. This is Jane Austen using letters as a form of entertainment and connection. But it also shows something important. Letter writing could be joyful. It could be fun. It could be a space where women played with language, experimented with voice, and expressed personality in ways they might not be able to do in public conversation. But letters were not just for courtship or family connection. Letters were political. Women used them to organize. During the abolitionist movement, women created vast letter writing networks. They wrote to each other, sharing information, coordinating fundraising efforts, planning strategies. These letters circulated privately, woman to woman, creating a shadow network of political organizing that men often did not even realize existed. And during the suffrage movement, letter writing became even more important. Women wrote to legislators. They wrote to newspapers. They wrote to each other, maintaining morale and coordination across vast distances. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton maintained an extensive correspondence for decades. Their letters were not just friendly chatter. They were strategy sessions. They planned campaigns, drafted arguments, coordinated actions, all through letters. Here is a detail that will astound you. Anne Hampton Brewster was a 19th-century American writer who lived in Rome. She wrote public letters, articles really, for the Philadelphia Evening Bulletin and the Boston Daily Advertiser. These were professional, polished pieces about art, culture, and society in Rome. But she also received private letters from friends and family. And researchers who have studied her diaries found something remarkable. The emotional tone of her public letters versus what she revealed in her diaries and private correspondence was completely different. In public, she was restrained, professional, neutral. In private, she poured out her feelings, her frustrations, her deepest emotions. This reveals something crucial. Women were performing different selves in different contexts, and in letters were where they could be most authentic, but only in private correspondence. Public letters required a mask. Private letters could reveal truth, and women had to navigate between these modes constantly, always aware that a letter might end up being read by unintended eyes. Now I want to talk about the physical act of evening letter writing, because this was not casual. This was after all the evening chores were done, after the children were in bed. After the kitchen was cleaned and the next day's bread dough was set to rise. A woman would sit down at a table or desk if she had one. Many women wrote at kitchen tables or on their laps. She would light a candle because lamp oil was expensive and candles were cheaper. She would take out her writing paper stored carefully in a desk drawer or box to keep it clean and dry. Then she would prepare her pen. If she was using a quill pen, which was common until steel pens became widely available in the mid-1800s, she would need to trim it first. Sharpening a quill pen was a skill that required practice. Cut the angle wrong and the pen would not write smoothly. The ink had to be the right consistency, not too thick or it would blob, not too thin or it would run. Many women mixed their own ink. They bought ink powder and combined it with water to the proper thickness. And then, finally, she could write. But even the act of writing required physical endurance, dipping the pen in ink every few words, being careful not to smudge, forming letters carefully in the dim light. It was slow work. A letter that you could type in 5 minutes today might take 30 minutes or more to write by hand in candlelight. But women wrote anyway. They wrote to sisters who had moved west. They wrote to children who had married and left home. They wrote to friends they might not see for months or years. They wrote to mothers, to aunts, to women in their sewing circles. And through these letters they maintained connections across impossible distances. One woman wrote in her diary in the 1850s about the joy she felt when she received a letter from her sister who had moved to California during the gold rush. She had not seen her sister in 3 years, might never see her again. But the letter, this piece of paper that had traveled thousands of miles, had been carried by ship and stagecoach and horseback. This letter brought her sister's voice into her home. She read it aloud to her family. She read it multiple times to herself. She kept it in a box with other treasured correspondence. And this is what letters did. They collapsed distance. They preserved voice. They created presence where there was absence. In a world without telephones, without instant messaging, without video calls, letters were how you stayed connected to people you loved. But here is something we might not think about. Letters also created pressure. If you received a letter, you were expected to respond within a reasonable time, usually within a week or two. Failing to respond was a social offense. It suggested you did not value the relationship. So, women felt obligated to write even when they were exhausted, even when they had nothing particularly interesting to say. Letter writing was a social duty as much as a pleasure. And there were rules about what you could write. An 1870 guide warned. Letter writing guides advised writing with absolute feeling and being cautious about saying too much. They also warned against saying the wrong things regardless of whether these wrong things had real feelings behind them. So you had to be honest but not too honest. Emotional but not too emotional. Interesting but not improper. Every letter was a tightrope walk. Women also used letters to maintain their position in society. If you invited to a party, you wrote a thank you letter. If someone experienced a death, you wrote a condolence letter. If someone was ill, you wrote a get well letter. These were not optional. They were required. And the quality of your letter was judged. A well-written condolence letter that struck the right tone of sympathy without being mlin. That was a mark of good breeding. A poorly written one that could damage your social standing. Let me share a condolence letter template that appeared in an 1870 letter writing guide. The tone is revealing. My dear Julia, you must have been prepared for some time past. From the gloomy tenor of my last few letters, for the mournful intelligence I have now to communicate. Our poor suffering friend has been called away to her final rest. The letter goes on in this vein, formal, restrained, religious. This was the expected tone. You could not be too raw in your grief. You had to package it appropriately. But some women chafed against these restrictions. Emily Dickinson, the poet, had a correspondence style that worried her brother. She was too creative, too playful, too unconventional in her letters. And in response to his criticism, she wrote back with dripping irony. I will be a little ninny, a little pussycatty, a little Red Riding Hood. I will wear a bee in my bonnet and a rosebud in my hair. And what remains to do, you shall be told hereafter. She was mocking the expectation that women's letters should be trivial and decorative. But even her mockery shows how much pressure existed to conform. Now here is the beautiful part. Despite all the rules, despite all the judgment, letters gave women a space to develop their voice. When you write regularly, you develop style. You learn rhythm. You discover what works. Many women who became writers, novelists, journalists, essayists developed their craft through letter writing. It was their training ground, and letters created history. We know so much about women's lives in the 1800s and 1900s because they wrote letters. Diaries are wonderful, but letters are even better because they show both sides of a conversation. They reveal relationships in real time. Historians studying women's lives depend heavily on letters because they are one of the few sources where women's voices come through directly unfiltered by male historians or editors. The decline of letter writing began with the telephone. When you could call someone and hear their voice immediately, the urgency of letter writing decreased. Then came email, texting, instant messaging. And now most of us go months or years without writing an actual letter by hand. We have gained immediacy. We have gained convenience. But what have we lost? We have lost the ritual. The sitting down with intention to communicate, the physical act of forming words with a pen, the care required to craft sentences knowing you cannot easily change them. We have lost the anticipation of waiting for a response. The excitement of seeing a letter in the mail addressed to you in handwriting. You recognize the ability to hold something physical that someone you love created specifically for you. And we have lost the record. Text messages are ephemeral. Emails pile up and get deleted. But letters in a box in an attic, those last. Those become history. Those tell future generations who we were and what we cared about. Martha finishes her letter. She blots the ink carefully. She folds the paper and seals it. In the morning, her husband will take it to town when he goes to sell grain, and he will leave it at the post office. It will travel for days, maybe weeks, before it reaches her sister back east. But it will reach her. And her sister will open it and hear Martha's voice across the distance. And that connection, fragile, slow, but real, that is what sustained women through their isolated lives. As Martha sets down her pen and blows out the candle, she does not know that we will still be talking about letters like hers more than a century later. She does not know that historians will study 19th century women's correspondence to understand how women thought, felt, and navigated their constrained worlds. She just knows that tonight she has spoken to someone she loves. And in the morning her voice will begin its journey. But the evening is not quite over. Because even as Martha climbs the stairs to bed in homes across America and Europe, other women are still awake. And they are not writing letters or quilting or mending. They are reading aloud. They are gathered with their families around the fire. And one person holds a book, maybe a novel, maybe a newspaper, maybe a collection of poetry, and that voice fills the room. And what happens in those moments of shared reading, the stories that get told, the worlds that open up, the way reading aloud shapes family bonds and passes down culture. That is another kind of magic entirely, one that deserves our full attention. So, let us turn the page together and see what women and their families discovered in the pages of books read by firelight in those precious evening hours. There is a knock at the door. It is 8 o'clock on a Tuesday evening in 1865, and the Thompson family is expecting guests. Not for dinner. Dinner was hours ago, not for games, though those might come later. No, tonight is reading night. And the neighbors have been waiting all week to find out what happens next in the story. Because here is something that might shock you. Before Netflix had us hooked on cliffhangers and binge watching, before television kept families glued to screens, there was reading aloud. And it was not some quaint quiet activity. It was the entertainment. It was addictive. It was emotional. And it created shared cultural moments that brought entire communities together in ways we struggle to achieve today, even with all our technology. Imagine this. You are sitting in a room lit by a single lamp or a few candles. The fire crackles in the background. Your father sits in the best chair holding the latest installment of a serialized novel. It arrived yesterday, a thin pamphlet, maybe 30 pages, costing just a shilling. Everyone in the room has been thinking about this moment for a month, because that is how long it has been since the last installment. 30 days of wondering whether the hero survived, whether the lovers reunited, whether justice was served. And now, finally, you get to find out. Your father clears his throat. He begins to read, and for the next hour, everyone in the room, your mother, your siblings, possibly the servants, maybe even a neighbor or two, everyone listens, completely focused. No one is checking their phone. No one can check their phone, obviously, because phones do not exist. There is just the voice, the story, and the shared experience of entering another world together. This was Victorian Netflix, and it was everywhere in wealthy homes and working-class cottages, in city apartments and rural farmhouses across England, America, and Europe. Millions of people structured their evenings around reading aloud. And the effects on culture, on literacy, on family bonds, on the very structure of how novels were written, those effects are still with us today, whether we realize it or not. Let me give you some numbers that will blow your mind. In the early 1800s, literacy rates in England were relatively low. Maybe 60% of men could read, and closer to 45% of women. But by 1870, after the Education Act made elementary schooling compulsory, those numbers shot up. By the end of the Victorian era, around 1900, over 90% of both men and women could read. 90%. In less than a century, England went from a largely illiterate population to near universal literacy. And reading aloud was one of the key mechanisms that made this possible. Here is why. If one person in a household could read, everyone in that household could access books. Literacy became communal rather than individual. A working-class family might only have one literate member. Maybe the oldest son who had attended school or the mother who had learned as a girl, but that one person could read aloud to everyone else. And as they listened, the non-readers picked up patterns. They learned how sentences work. They absorbed vocabulary. They started to understand the relationship between spoken words and written symbols. Reading aloud was informal education happening every single evening in homes across the country. And it was not just families reading to each other. It was everywhere. In factories, one worker might read the newspaper aloud during breaks while others listened and discussed. In public houses, what we would call bars or pubs, someone would read aloud from the latest Penny Dreadful, those sensational weekly serials about detectives and criminals and supernatural events. Street corners had readers who would recite news or stories to crowds who gathered to listen. Reading aloud was a public performance, a shared experience, a social glue. But let us focus on the home for a moment because that is where reading aloud had its most profound impact. The typical Victorian family reading session had a structure. Usually the father read. This was his role, his performance, his moment of authority. One historian, Philip Collins, notes that in many Gentile houses, Papa would read the installments of successive novels to the assembled family. Papa, the father figure presiding over the literary experience. But here is something interesting. Mothers also read aloud, though it is mentioned less frequently in historical accounts. Why? Because men's activities were documented more thoroughly. But women absolutely read aloud to their children, to each other, to mixed family groups. They just did not get the same historical recognition for it. And children were the primary audience for much of this reading, but they were not passive listeners. They were learning. One of the photographs we have of Charles Dickens shows him sitting in a chair in his garden reading to his two daughters, Mia and Katie. They're listening intently. And Dickens is not just reading. He is performing. His face is animated. His voice modulates. He brings the characters to life. Because this is crucial to understand. Reading aloud in the Victorian era was not monotone. It was not like someone mechanically converting text to sound. It was performance art. The reader was expected to do different voices for different characters, to pause for dramatic effect, to modulate tone and volume, to create suspense, to make people laugh or cry or gasp. A good reader was highly valued. If you could read aloud well, you were invited places. You became popular. Your skill was a social asset, and the novels themselves were written for this. Charles Dickens knew his work would be read aloud. So he wrote dialogue that sounded natural when spoken. He created characters with distinctive speech patterns. He used punctuation, lots of dashes, ellipses, exclamation points to guide the reader's performance. He ended chapters on cliffhangers specifically designed to leave the listening audience desperate for more. Quick Papers, Dickens's breakthrough novel, was published in monthly installments from April 1836 to November 1837. It cost 1 shilling per installment. A complete novel in book form might cost 31 shillings and 6 pence, nearly a month's wages for many workers, but spread over 19 months at a shilling each, affordable. And that affordability meant that families who could never buy a complete book could participate in literary culture. They bought each installment. They read it aloud. They discussed it. They waited eagerly for the next one. And waiting was part of the magic. When an installment ended on a cliffhanger, everyone had to wait a month to find out what happened next. Can you imagine? A month. You could not binge the next episode. You could not look up spoilers online. You had to sit with the uncertainty, the anticipation. And you know what? That built community because everyone was waiting together. You could discuss theories with neighbors. You could speculate. You could bond over shared suspense. Let me tell you about one specific moment that captures this perfectly. When Dickens's novel, The Old Curiosity Shop, was being serialized, the final installments involved the fate of little Nell, beloved child character. Would she die? Would she be saved? The tension was unbearable. When the ship carrying the final installment arrived in New York Harbor, crowds gathered at the dock, and as passengers disembarked, people shouted from the shore, "Is little Nell dead?" They could not wait another moment to know. The ship passengers shouted back the answer, and people wept openly on the docks. This is what reading aloud created. Shared emotional experiences on a massive scale. Before mass media, before radio, before television, reading aloud was how culture spread. It was how stories became communal property. It was how a nation or a community could all be thinking about the same characters, the same plot twists, the same moral questions. Now there was a darker side to this. Reading aloud also functioned as censorship because novels were read aloud in family settings with children present, with servants listening, with the assumption of a mixed audience. Publishers and authors knew that certain content would not be acceptable. Anything too sexual, too violent, too morally ambiguous risked rejection. Publishers literally told authors that their work needed to be suitable for reading aloud in any family circle. Thomas Hardy, and George Moore, novelists later in the Victorian period, complained bitterly about this constraint. Hardy tried to publish Jude the Obscure, a novel dealing with sexuality, marriage, and religion in complex ways. Harper's, the publisher, rejected it because it contained material which could not be read aloud in any family circle. Hardy was furious. He felt that the practice of family reading was stifling English literature, forcing authors to write watered-down moralistic stories rather than confronting difficult truths. And he had a point. Reading aloud shaped what got published. It shaped what stories were told. It favored certain plots. Clear good versus evil, eventual triumph of virtue, romantic love that ended in marriage, villains who were punished. Ambiguity was harder. Moral complexity was because if a father could not comfortably read it aloud to his 13-year-old daughter, it would not sell. But within those constraints, incredible stories were still told. The Bronte sisters, Charlotte, Emily, and Anne, wrote novels that pushed boundaries while still being technically acceptable for family reading. Jane Eyre deals with power, class, gender, hidden wives, and moral choices, but it does so in a way that could be read aloud. Jane Austen's novels are sharp social satire skewering the marriage market and class pretensions, but on the surface they are proper courtship stories suitable for family consumption. These authors were working within the system and subverting it simultaneously. And readers, listening readers, could catch the subtext. They could hear the irony in Austen's voice. They could sense the rebellion in Bronte's characters. The best authors wrote on multiple levels, so that children heard an adventure story while adults heard social critique. Now, what did this actually look like in practice? Let me walk you through a typical evening. The family has finished supper. The table is cleared. In wealthier homes, everyone moves to the parlor or drawing room. In working-class homes, they might stay in the kitchen or the main living space. The reader takes position, usually in the best chair, closest to the light source. Everyone else arranges themselves around the room. Women often bring needlework. We are back to that, so their hands stay busy while they listen. Men might smoke a pipe. Children sit on the floor or on low stools. The reader begins. Maybe it is the latest installment of a Dickens novel. Maybe it is a Gothic thriller. Maybe it is a collection of poems. Maybe it is just the newspaper reading the important articles aloud so everyone stays informed about politics and events. The reading lasts anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours depending on the material and the audience's interest. And here is what is remarkable. During this time, everyone is experiencing the same story at the same pace. No one can skip ahead. No one can read faster or slower than the group. You're all in it together. If a character does something shocking, everyone gasps at the same moment. Something is funny, you laugh together. If it is sad, you might all cry. This synchronous emotional experience, we hardly have that anymore. Even when we watch television together, people are often half distracted by phones. But reading aloud demanded full attention because if you zoned out, you lost the thread of the story, and breaks in the reading sparked discussion. Someone might stop and say, "Wait, why did the character do that?" And the family would debate. They would share interpretations. They would predict what might happen next. The story was not passively consumed. It was actively engaged with. It was social and participatory in a way that solitary reading, what we mostly do now, can never be. Let me share something that will resonate with modern experiences. Do you remember when Game of Thrones was airing and everyone watched each episode or at the same time, and then the next day at work or school people would gather and discuss what happened? That water cooler conversation, that shared cultural moment, that is exactly what Victorian reading aloud created. Except it happened every night in homes across the country, and it happened with books rather than television. But there is another layer to this. Reading aloud was also a form of control, particularly for young women. The Victorian era was deeply concerned about what young women read. Solitary reading was seen as dangerous. If a young woman read alone, silently, she might encounter ideas that were improper. She might develop thoughts that challenged social norms. But if reading happened aloud, supervised by a parent or male authority figure, her literary consumption could be monitored and guided. She could only hear what was deemed appropriate. Some young women chafed against this. They wanted to read freely, privately, without supervision. And as silent reading became more common toward the end of the 19th century, they gained that freedom. But it came with judgment. Silent reading was sometimes called selfish or antisocial. The idea was that reading aloud was communal and virtuous, while silent reading was isolating and potentially morally suspect. Interesting, is it not? We think of reading as a fundamentally solitary activity. But for most of human history it was not. It was communal. And the shift to silent private reading was actually controversial. People worried it would destroy family bonds. They worried it would lead to social fragmentation. And you know what? They were not entirely wrong. We did lose something when we stopped reading aloud together regularly. Here is a detail that shows how embedded reading aloud was in the culture. Charles Dickens in his later years gave public reading tours. He traveled around England and America, performing excerpts from his novels to huge crowds. People paid to hear him read his own work aloud. These events were packed, emotional. Dickens would read The Death of Little Nell, and grown men in the audience would weep openly. He would read comic passages and the room would explode with laughter. This was entertainment before recorded sound, before film, before television. The human voice bringing a story to life was the highest form of mass entertainment available. And here is something most people do not know. Dickens wrote his novels with these public readings in mind. He thought about how sentences would sound when performed. He thought about pacing for oral delivery. He thought about moments that would get big reactions from a live audience. Scholars who study his punctuation note that he paid meticulous attention to every dash, every pause, every emphasis mark, because these were performance notes. His written text was in a very real sense a musical score for the voice. So when a father read Dickens aloud to his family, he was performing a role that Dickens had carefully scripted. The pauses were indicated. The emphases were suggested. The rhythm was built in. Reading aloud was not just transmitting information. It was executing a performance that the author had choreographed. Now I need to be honest about class differences here. The kind of reading aloud I have been describing, leisurely evening sessions with popular novels, that was more common in middle-class and upper-class homes. Working-class families had less time and less access to books. But they still participated in reading aloud culture, just in different forms. Penny dreadfuls and cheap weekly serials were designed for working-class audiences. These stories were sensational, action-packed, sometimes lurid. They cost very little, 1 penny, hence the name, and they were passed around, shared, read aloud in public spaces and crowded homes. And here is what matters. Whether you were reading Dickens in a comfortable parlor or a penny dreadful in a cramped tenement, the act of reading aloud created community. It brought people together. It gave them common stories, common references, a common culture. The decline of reading aloud began gradually. As literacy rates rose and more people could read for themselves, the necessity of reading aloud decreased. As electric lights made evening reading easier, you did not need someone positioned perfectly by a candle. Individual reading became more practical. As books became cheaper and more available through public libraries, families could afford multiple books so people could read different things simultaneously rather than gathering around a single text. And then came radio in the 1920s and 30s, which offered voice and story but removed the physical presence of the reader. Then television in the 1950s, which added images, and now streaming services which give us unlimited stories instantly available, consumed individually on personal devices. We have never had more access to stories. But we have also never been more isolated in our consumption of them. What have we lost? We have lost the ritual, the gathering, the shared pacing, the experience of moving through a story together. We have lost the art of vocal performance. How many people today could read aloud for an hour and keep an audience engaged? We have lost the discussions that happen when everyone has experienced the same material at the same time. And we have lost the intergenerational sharing. Children experiencing adult stories adapted through a parent's voice. Older family members passing down culture through the stories they choose to read and how they read them. But here is the beautiful thing. Reading aloud never completely died. It just transformed. Parents still read to young children, picture books, bedtime stories. Teachers read to students. Book clubs sometimes include reading passages aloud. Audiobooks are a massive industry bringing professional vocal performances of novels to millions of listeners. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, when families were isolated together, many rediscovered reading aloud. Parents read chapter books to older children. Couples read novels to each other. People found comfort in the old ritual. Because it turns out the human voice telling a story is powerful. It always has been. It is how we passed down history before writing existed. It is how we taught morals, culture, identity. It is how we connected, how we bonded, how we made meaning together. Reading aloud taps into something ancient and fundamental about being human. As the Thompson family finishes their reading for the evening, as the father closes the book and everyone stretches and begins discussing what they just heard, as the candles burn low and someone rises to tend the fire, something else is happening in other homes. Because not all evenings were spent in quiet, controlled reading, some evenings were loud, raucous, full of laughter and competition and quick thinking. Some evenings families gathered not to hear a story but to play games. And the games they played, word games, logic games, performance games. Those games reveal yet another layer of evening culture that we have almost completely forgotten. A layer that was about quick wit, clever thinking, and the pure joy of structured fun in a world that demanded so much seriousness. And that is where we need to go next. So keep your energy up. We are about to enter the parlor where the real entertainment is about to begin. Laughter erupts from the parlor. Someone has just guessed completely wrong and the room dissolves into giggles. It is 9 o'clock on a winter evening in 1878. The reading is finished. The teacups have been cleared. And now comes the part of the evening when minds sharpen. When wit matters more than wealth, and when a clever 14-year-old girl can absolutely demolish her pompous uncle at a game that requires nothing but quick thinking. Welcome to the golden age of parlor games. And I need you to forget everything you think you know about Victorian propriety and stiffness. Because when the game started, the gloves came off. Sometimes literally, depending on which game was being played. Here is what you need to understand. These people had no screens, no apps, no ways to passively consume entertainment. If they wanted to be entertained, they had to create it themselves. And they got really, really good at it. The parlor games of the 1800s were not simple time wasters. They were sophisticated intellectual exercises, social experiments, performance opportunities, and occasionally absolute chaos. And they reveal a side of our ancestors that we rarely see. Playful, creative, sometimes ridiculous, and deeply human. Let me start with the most famous one. Charades. But here is the thing. Victorian charades were not what you're picturing. You're thinking of the modern version where you act out movie titles silently while people shout guesses, right? That is not what charades meant in the 1800s. Not even close. Regency and Victorian charades were verbal riddles. They were elaborate word puzzles spoken aloud, usually in the form of poems. Here is how it worked. You would take a word and break it into syllables. Then you would create enigmatic descriptions of each syllable and finally describe the whole word without ever stating what the word actually was. The listeners had to figure out what word you were describing based on these cryptic clues. Let me give you a real example from the Austen family. Yes, Jane Austen's family loved charades. Here is one that has been attributed to members of the Austen household. In confinement I am chained every day. Yet my enemies need not be crowing. I know no poor prisoner more favored than I, or one who is more worthy of pitying. Can you guess what word this describes? Think about it for a moment. The answer is hen coop. Hen is the first syllable. A female chicken which is kept in confinement, chained meaning confined. Coop is the second syllable and the whole word is hen coop. See how clever that is? You had to think linguistically, break down words, understand double meanings, play with language. This was not passive entertainment. This was active mental gymnastics. And these riddles could get incredibly complex. Some charades were written as multi-stanza poems that took 5 minutes to recite. The best ones were so clever that even very intelligent people struggled to solve them. Families kept charade books where they wrote down their favorites. They passed these books around, challenged friends with particularly difficult ones, and competed to create the most elegant or deceptive riddles. Now, here is what makes this fascinating from a social perspective. Charades were one of the few arenas where youth could legitimately outsmart their elders. A clever teenage girl who was good with words could solve a charade that stumped her father. And she could create one that made the whole room stop and think. In a society where age and gender determined so much of your authority and respect, parlor games created temporary spaces where intelligence mattered more than status. The actress charades that we know today, the silent acting version, did not become popular until the mid to late 1800s, and even then they were not the main form. Verbal charades remained the preferred version well into the early 20th century. Only gradually did the acting component take over and the verbal riddles fade away. But charades were just the beginning. Let me tell you about blind man's bluff. You might know a version of this. One person is blindfolded and tries to catch others while they run around. Simple, right? But the Victorian version had layers of social complexity that would surprise you. Here's how it worked. One player was blindfolded and spun around several times to disorient them. Then they had to try to catch another player. Once they caught someone, they had to identify who that person was by touching their face, hair, or clothing while still blindfolded. If they guessed correctly, that person became the next blindfolded player. If they guessed wrong, they remained blindfolded and tried again. Now, think about what this meant in a society where touching someone of the opposite sex was usually forbidden. Blind man's bluff created a socially acceptable space for physical contact that would otherwise be scandalous. A young man could touch a young woman's face, could run his fingers through her hair, could put his hands on her shoulders, all while blindfolded in full view of chaperones and family members. It was thrilling precisely because it pushed the boundaries of propriety while remaining technically innocent, and the opportunities for flirtation were endless. A young woman could position herself so that the blindfolded young man she fancied would catch her. She could make small sounds to guide him toward her, or if she wanted to avoid someone, she could stay completely silent and still. The game was as much about navigation of social dynamics as it was about physical agility. One etiquette guide from the 1880s warned that blind man's bluff could become too boisterous and should only be played in homes with sturdy furniture that could withstand some bumping. That warning tells you everything about how physical and energetic this game could get. Victorian parlors were not always quiet and controlled. Sometimes they were full of running, shrieking, laughing chaos. Another wildly popular game was 20 questions. The rules were simple and elegant. One person thinks of an object. The other players can ask up to 20 yes or no questions to figure out what it is. The person who guesses correctly gets to think of the next object. But what made this brilliant was the strategy involved. You had to ask questions that narrowed possibilities efficiently. Is it alive? Is it larger than a bread box? Is it made by humans? Each question was a logical step, eliminating whole categories of possibilities. Good players developed systems. They would start with broad categories, then narrow progressively. Bad players asked random, specific questions and wasted their 20 chances. And watching people play revealed their thinking patterns. A merchant might ask about value and utility. A scholar might ask about origin and composition. A romantic might ask about beauty and sentiment. The questions you asked revealed how your mind worked, what you valued, what you noticed about the world. Families playing regularly developed shared knowledge and inside jokes. If your brother once spent 15 questions trying to guess butter churn and still failed, that became family law. If your aunt always asked the same 3 opening questions in the same order, people would tease her about it. The game created a microculture within the family. Now, let me tell you about a game that absolutely delights me because it is so bizarre and so Victorian. It is called tableaux vivants, which is French for living pictures. Here is the concept. Players would create a frozen scene, a famous painting, a historical event, a moment from literature, using themselves as the subjects. They would dress up, arrange themselves carefully, and then freeze in position while the audience admired the scene, and tried to guess what they were depicting. This required planning, creativity, costumes, props, and the ability to hold perfectly still, and Victorians took it very seriously. They would spend hours preparing elaborate tableaux. They would create lighting effects with candles and lamps. They would use household items to create convincing props, and then they would hold their poses sometimes for several minutes while people examined the scene from different angles. Why did they love this? Because it combined several Victorian obsessions. Art appreciation. You had to know famous paintings and scenes to create good tableau. Historical knowledge. Many tableaux depicted moments from history or mythology. Physical control and grace. Holding a pose required discipline and performance. You were literally making yourself into art, and it was one of the few acceptable ways to engage in something close to theater. For many religious families, actual theater was considered morally suspect. But tableaux vivants, those were educational, those were artistic, those were acceptable. So young people who loved drama and performance could satisfy that urge through living pictures. Here is another game that shows how clever these people were. It is called bullet pudding. Jane Austen's niece, Fanny Austen Knight, mentioned this game in her diary. She wrote that the family had different amusements every evening, and she specifically lists bullet pudding as one of them. Here is how it worked. You made a cone of flour on a plate and put a bullet, an actual lead bullet, on top. Players took turns slicing away pieces of the flour cone with a knife. The person who made the bullet fall had to retrieve it using only their mouth, getting flour all over their face in the process. It were messy, ridiculous, and apparently hilarious. Can you imagine proper Victorian families in their nice parlors deliberately getting flour all over their faces for fun? It completely upends our image of stiff formal people who never relaxed. They were playful. They were silly. They were willing to look ridiculous for a laugh. And that is the theme I want you to notice. Parlor games created spaces where normal social rules were temporarily suspended, where status mattered less, where women could be clever and competitive, where young people could take center stage, where physical contact was allowed, where silliness was encouraged. The parlor game was a pressure release valve in a society that demanded constant propriety. Let me tell you about one more game that reveals a lot about the Victorian mind. It is called Consequences, and it is a writing game. Here is how it played. Everyone gets a piece of paper. You write a man's name at the top. Could be someone famous, someone fictional, or someone in the room. Then you fold the paper so the name is hidden and pass it to the next person. That person writes a woman's name, folds the paper, and passes it on. The next person writes where they met. The next writes what he said to her. The next writes what she said to him. The next writes what the consequence was. Finally, someone writes what the world said about it. At the end, you unfold all the papers and read them aloud. And because each person only saw what they wrote, the combinations are usually absurd and hilarious. You might end up with, Napoleon met Queen Victoria in a chicken coop. He said, "Your hat is on fire." She said, "I have been expecting you." The consequence was they started a bakery. The world said, "What took them so long?" The joy was in the randomness, the creativity, the unexpected combinations. But notice what the game reveals. It has a formula. Man meets woman. They speak. There is a consequence. Society reacts. This is the structure of courtship and marriage, which was the central drama of Victorian social life. The game lets you play with that structure. Make it silly, subvert it. It is social satire disguised as entertainment. And these games were not occasional diversions. They were regular features of evening life. Wealthy families might play several nights a week. Middle-class families with less leisure time might play on weekends or special occasions, but everyone knew how to play. Everyone participated. Gaming literacy was a form of social literacy. Here is what I find beautiful about this. The parlor game era was the golden age of free creative face-to-face entertainment. You did not need to buy anything. You did not need special equipment except maybe a blindfold or some paper and pencils. You just needed people, a room, and imagination. The barrier to entry was near zero. Rich and poor alike could play most of these games. Compare that to today. We have unlimited entertainment options, but most of them are purchased, packaged, produced by someone else. We consume rather than create. We watch rather than play. And most of our entertainment is designed for individual consumption. Even when we are technically together. How many families sit in the same room? Each person on a different device consuming different content. The room is shared, but the experience is isolated. Parlor games forced togetherness, forced interaction, forced creativity, and yes, they could be annoying. Imagine being forced to play charades with your irritating cousin every Sunday for years. Imagine having to laugh politely at your uncle's terrible puns during word games. Imagine being the person who always lost at 20 questions and having to endure the family's teasing. It was not always delightful, but it created bonds, shared memories, family culture. The inside jokes that came from years of playing together gave families a private language, a shared history. When siblings scattered to different cities or countries, they carried those memories with them. And when they reunited years later, someone could say, "Remember the time we played blind man's bluff and father knocked over the vase?" And everyone would laugh because they all remembered. Now you might be wondering, why did parlor games decline? Why did we stop doing this? The answer is technology, but not in the way you might think. It was not just that television offered easier entertainment. It was that technology changed the rhythm of evenings. Electric lights meant evenings were no longer special, bounded time. You could read or work late into the night. The distinction between daytime and evening blurred. Telephones meant you could socialize without gathering in person. Radio offered professional entertainment. Cars made it easier to go out rather than entertain at home. Gradually the evening gathering became less necessary, less frequent, and finally almost extinct. By the mid-century, parlor games were considered old-fashioned, quaint, something grandparents might remember, but young people had no interest in. And for several decades they nearly disappeared. But here is the twist. They're coming back. Board game cafes are thriving in cities around the world. Escape rooms are a booming industry. Trivia nights pack bars and restaurants. People are hungry for in-person collaborative creative entertainment. They are tired of screens. They want to look at faces, hear laughter, solve puzzles together. The specific games are different. We are not gathering to solve verbal charades in poetic form. But the impulse is the same. The desire to use our minds playfully in community with others. The desire to create rather than consume. The desire to be present, to connect, to share an experience that is spontaneous and unrepeatable. And some families are literally bringing back Victorian parlor games. There are websites dedicated to explaining the rules. There are books collecting historical games. People are hosting parlor game nights with period costumes, serving period food, learning the games their great-great-grandparents played, and they are discovering that these games are actually really fun. That charades based on wordplay are intellectually satisfying in a way that modern charades are not. That games requiring no equipment are freeing. That silliness is underrated. As the evening of games winds down in that parlor in 1878, as people begin to yawn and gather their things, as candles burn low and someone mentions it is getting late, there is a sense of satisfaction, not from winning, though winners are pleased, but from the shared experience, from the laughter, the thinking, the absurdity, the connection, from being together in a way that mattered. And as they prepare to end the evening, one more ritual remains. Because in many homes, particularly religious ones, the day does not close with games. It closes with something more solemn, more grounding, more reflective. It closes with prayer, with Bible reading, with a moment of quiet contemplation that acknowledges something beyond the everyday. And that spiritual dimension of evening life, how women led devotionals, how religion structured time, how faith provided meaning in hard lives. That is territory we must explore. Because for countless women, the evening prayer circle was not just a ritual. It was empowerment. It was one of the few spaces where their voices led, where their spiritual authority was recognized, where they could speak and be heard. So let us bow our heads and enter that quiet, powerful space together. The clock strikes 10. The games have ended. The laughter fades. And now in households across Protestant England and America, a shift occurs. The mood changes. Backs straighten, voices quiet because it is time for evening devotions. And in this moment, this daily ritual that happened in millions of homes for hundreds of years, women found something unexpected. They found their voice. They found authority. They found a space where they could lead, teach, and speak with power. In a world that silenced them almost everywhere else, the evening prayer circle let them be heard. But here is what you need to understand. This was not always gentle or comforting. Evening devotions were complex, sometimes oppressive, occasionally liberating, and always deeply meaningful in ways we struggle to comprehend today. Because faith was not a Sunday-only activity, it was woven into every aspect of daily life. And the evening closing ritual shaped how people understood their existence, their purpose, and their place in the universe. Let me paint the scene. The family gathers. In some homes, this includes servants who are required to attend whether they want to or not. Everyone sits. The head of household, usually the father, opens the family Bible. He reads a passage aloud. Then he leads the family in prayer. Everyone kneels, heads bow, and for the next 10 to 30 minutes, the spiritual work of the day happens. This was called family worship or household devotions, and it was expected in respectable Protestant homes, not optional, expected. If you visited someone's home and stayed past a certain hour, you participated in their evening devotions. If you were a servant in the house, you attended. If you were a child, you had no choice. This was as mandatory as dinner. Now, why am I telling you this in a series about women's evening activities? Because here is the fascinating part. While men usually led family worship, women had significant roles that gave them rare authority. And in some contexts, prayer circles, charitable societies, Sunday school teaching that happened on weekday evenings, women led entirely. They prayed aloud. They interpreted scripture. They made theological arguments. They exercised spiritual leadership in ways that were forbidden to them in almost every other sphere. Let me give you a specific example. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, founded in 1874, was one of the most powerful political organizations of the late 19th century. And it started as prayer circles. Women gathering in the evenings to pray about the problem of alcoholism which was destroying families across America. These were not quiet private prayers. These were organized strategic public prayers. Women would march to saloons, form circles outside and pray loudly for the establishment to close. They would sing hymns. They would kneel in the street. And here is what makes this remarkable. These were respectable middle-class women. Women who in any other context would be expected to be silent, obedient, confined to the home. But in the name of Christian duty and prayer, they could occupy public space. They could confront men. They could make demands. They could organize politically. All under the cover of religious devotion. Think about the genius of this. In a society that forbade women from speaking in public, from entering politics, from challenging male authority, prayer was the loophole. Because who could argue against prayer? Who could tell a woman she could not pray for the moral improvement of society? The evening prayer meeting became a training ground for female activism that would eventually lead to suffrage, to social reform movements, to women claiming their full civic rights. But let us go back to the home because that is where most evening religious practice happened. And it was not always empowering. For many women, evening devotions were one more obligation in a day full of obligations. You have cooked, cleaned, cared for children, done needlework, managed a household. You are exhausted. And now you must sit through 30 minutes of prayer and Bible reading trying to appear spiritually engaged when all you want is to collapse into bed. And the content of those prayers and readings often reinforced women's subordination. Passages about wives obeying husbands. Sermons about female modesty and submission. Prayers thanking God for the natural order that placed men above women. Evening devotions could be a daily reminder of your lesser status, dressed up in holy language. But here is where it gets complicated. Because for other women, evening devotions were genuine comfort. Life in the 1800s was hard. Child's mortality was high. You might lose half your children before they reached adulthood. Disease, accidents, economic instability, these were constant threats. And in that context, the promise of heaven, the belief in a loving God who saw your suffering, the community of faith that supported you, these were not oppressive. These were lifelines. I found a diary entry from a woman in Vermont written in 1863 during the Civil War. Her husband was fighting for the Union. She had not heard from him in 3 months. She wrote, "Evening devotions are the only time I feel peace. When we pray together, the children and I feel he is with us still. I feel God holds him faith. I can bear another day knowing we will pray again tonight." For her, evening devotions were not oppression. They were survival. And women often shaped the content of family worship more than we might expect. Yes, the father read the Bible, but the mother often chose which passages to read. She suggested which hymns to sing. She guided the prayers, sometimes explicitly, sometimes subtly. In the evening religious space, women exercised a quiet but real influence over their family's spiritual formation. Let me tell you about Sabbath evenings specifically because those were different. Sunday evenings in strict Protestant households were rigidly controlled. No games, no secular reading, no work beyond absolute necessity. The entire evening was devoted to religious activity, more Bible reading, more prayers. Sometimes the family would catechize the children, asking them questions about Christian doctrine and requiring memorized answers. For children, this could be tedious or terrifying depending on the family. Imagine being 7 years old, tired from a long day of church and strict behavior. And now you have to recite the Westminster Catechism perfectly or face your father's disapproval. Some children grew up hating Sundays because of the oppressive religious atmosphere, but other families made Sabbath evenings warm and meaningful. The mother might tell Bible stories in ways that captivated children's imaginations. The father might explain scripture in gentle, thoughtful ways. The hymns sung together might be beautiful. The sense of setting aside one evening per week for spiritual reflection might feel sacred rather than oppressive. And here is what I find most interesting. The strictness of Sabbath evenings created a rhythm to the week. 6 days of varied evening activities, needlework, reading, games, visiting. Then Sunday evening, which was different, set apart holy. This created a temporal structure that many people found meaningful. It marked time. It created contrast. It gave shape to existence. Now, let me talk about prayer circles specifically because these were powerful spaces for women. In many communities, women organized weekly evening prayer meetings. Sometimes these were at the church. Sometimes they rotated between members' homes, and these were women-only spaces. No men present, which meant women could speak freely. What did they pray about? Everything. The salvation of their children's souls. The conversion of their husbands or neighbors. The success of missionary work abroad. Social problems like poverty, prostitution, alcoholism. And as they prayed together, they also talked. They shared information. They coordinated charitable activities. They organized. These prayer circles were simultaneously spiritual gatherings and organizing meetings. And women learned to speak. To pray aloud in front of others requires confidence. It requires the ability as to formulate thoughts coherently on the spot. It requires spiritual authority. The belief that your words matter, that God hears you, that you have something worth saying. For women who were hate in every other context, learning to pray aloud in these circles was transformative. They found their voice literally. Some of these prayer circles led directly to social action. Women would pray about poverty and then they would organize food drives. They would pray about illiteracy and then they would start reading programs. They would pray about visa and then they would march on saloons. The line between prayer and activism was porous. Prayer was not passive. Prayer was how women gathered, strategized, and then acted. But I want to be honest about something. Not all evening religious practice was about community and empowerment. For many women, it was also about fear. Evangelical Protestant theology in the 19th century emphasized hell, damnation, and the constant possibility of losing your salvation. Evening prayers often included desperate pleas for God's mercy, confessions of unworthiness, expressions of terror about the afterlife. One woman's diary from the 1840s records her nightly prayers. I beg God again to show me if I am truly saved. The fear consumes me. What if I am deceived? What if my faith is false? What if I am damned? This is not comforting bedtime spirituality. This is existential terror. And for women raised in strict religious environments, this fear could dominate their inner lives. The evening examination of conscience, reviewing your day for sins, confessing them, begging forgiveness. This was a nightly ritual for many devout women. And while it could be meaningful and lead to genuine moral growth, it could also be psychologically damaging. Constant self-scrutiny, constant guilt, constant fear of divine punishment. This was the dark side of evening religious practice. But here is what I want you to notice. Even in that fear, even in that oppression, women were engaging with big questions. What is the meaning of life? What happens after death? How should I live? What is my purpose? Evening devotions forced engagement with existential and ethical questions that modern life often lets us avoid. We distract ourselves constantly. We numb ourselves with entertainment. But these women sat with the big questions every single evening. And that produced a kind of depth, a kind of seriousness about existence that we've largely lost. And they passed this down. Mothers teaching children to pray. Grandmothers explaining scripture to grandchildren. Women were the primary religious educators in the home. Sunday school teachers were mostly women. Prayer circle leaders were women. Women shaped the next generation's faith. This was real power, even if it was not recognized as such. Let me give you a statistic that might surprise you. In evangelical Protestant churches in the 19th century, women made up anywhere from 60 to 75% of active members. Men attended church, but women were the core, the engine, the committed believers. And much of that commitment was built and maintained through evening devotional practices. The prayer circles, the Bible studies, the missionary societies that met in the evenings, These created networks of women connected by shared faith and shared purpose. Now, what happened to all of this? Why did evening devotions decline? The same factors that eroded other evening rituals played a role. Electric lights meant evenings were less bounded. Radio and television offered alternative ways to spend evening time. Declining church attendance in the 20th century meant religious practice became less central. Families became more fragmented with members having different schedules and activities. But there is another factor. As women gained access to other forms of power, education, careers, political rights, the appeal of religion as a space for female authority decreased. Why lead a prayer circle when you could run for office? Why organize a missionary society when you could join a professional organization? The very success of women's movements meant that religion lost some of its unique appeal as a space where women could lead. But not entirely. Even today, religious communities, particularly evangelical, Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox Christian, as well as many Jewish and Muslim communities, are sustained primarily by women. Women who organize, teach, pray, and create the social fabric of faith communities. The tradition has not disappeared. It has transformed.